Welcome back to another video based on my book with Ivo Welsh on global climate change. And today we're going to be talking about economic models of climate change. A word of warning, this is going to be a little more complicated than the previous videos. That simply is unavoidable. There is complexity involved with these models. And in the development of these models, everyone owes a great deal of gratitude to this man, William Nordhaus of Yale University. Beginning almost 30 years ago, he began to develop what are now called integrated assessment models. They are integrated in the sense that they include not only an economic model of production and consumption, but also a climate science model of how economic production and consumption leads to the production of greenhouse gases, which in turn leads to rising temperatures, which then feeds back again into the model in terms of damages that alter production, and so forth. So it integrates economics, climate science, and the impact of climate events on the economy. And for this work, Mr. Nordhaus was awarded the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics. Certainly well deserved. And here in a nutshell, and this is a nutshell, this is a simplification, is how an integrated model of the economy and the climate works. And this is a highly simplified graph, though it doesn't maybe look that simple. On the left are the two external inputs into the model. And there's actually a third as well, which is rarely called out, which is population growth and is assumed to occur at a constant rate. The first input that is shown in the schematic in the orange box is labeled CO2 tax. It is under the control of the modeler, who can tweak it to see what the outcomes will be. For arrows, we use red in the model to indicate negative input or feedback, and blue to indicate positive input or feedback. Higher taxes, for example, higher CO2 taxes, reduce the amount of money available to producers, which in turn reduces production, so the arrow is red. Technology is the second external input. Technology marches steadily upward and improves production, which is why the arrow is blue. The rate of improvement in that technology is available to the modeler as an input choice. The cyan box in the middle of the diagram is consumption, the key output. Consumption here is to be interpreted broadly, including all goods and services. It could and should also include such aspects as human pleasure derived from the natural environment, including species diversity. The ultimate goal of the modeler is to adjust the annual CO2 taxes to obtain the highest possible time path of consumption. And the word time path is important here. This schematic shows one particular year of production, but the model includes typically a century or more, year after year after year. So when we talk about consumption, we're really talking about the present value of the time path of all future consumption. And that's important because, as we'll see, you have to then weight how you consider the production and consumption of future generations compared with our own. For example, remember this graph from a previous video on warming. Notice, let's pick an RCP. Let's pick RCP 6. Here we are right now. notice that most of the warming, including the warming due to our production decisions today, occurs in the future. So the damages from the model are much larger in 2100 than they are today, because that's when most of the warmings occurred. Well, how do we compare costs imposed on people at 2100 with costs today? And in making that comparison, you have to recognize that the economy keeps growing. The world economy has been growing at over 2% per capita. If it continues that way, by 2100, people will be almost 5 times richer than they are today on average. In addition, they're going to be a whole lot smarter. And God only knows how much improved their computer technology will be. By that time, there may be remarkable improvements in artificial intelligence. So we might think that people could use all that wealth and knowledge to deal with climate change. So we shouldn't be too concerned now with reducing our own production and consumption in order to benefit them. And this is something that the integrated models do take account of. Each year is treated separately. So the model weights future consumption and damages according to something called the discount rate. And I think the best way to explain how all this works is to look at the output of the integrated assessment models, and that will allow us to understand how the inputs affect the outputs. So let's do that now. Here is the primary output from an integrated assessment model. The key model input that has been tuned by the modeler is the CO2 tax. In the model, the base scenario is the pessimistic one without any intervention to combat climate change. The Nordhaus solution, shown as Nordhaus in blue, is a welfare maximizing solution based on aggregate consumption. The black, average 2 degrees centigrade to 2200, is a scenario that is a constrained welfare maximizing solution, keeping the average temperature by 2200 below an increase of 2 degrees centigrade, as discussed at one of the international conferences and meetings. So, you can see that the Nordhaus solution starts at a CO2 tax of about $50 per ton, and then rises over time to 2100 to $300 per ton. Comparatively, in the base case, of course, there is no tax. That's business as usual. To limit the increase to 2 degrees requires more stringent taxes to discourage production, which leads to emissions. And you can see there the tax starts at about $60 per ton and rises all the way to slightly in excess of 500. Now the model key output is consumption, and consumption, remember, includes intangibles such as appreciation of the environment. In the base case is seen as no change in consumption over time. The Nordhaus case starts lower because of the tax, but then eventually rises to a higher level. With the constraint on temperature, the decline in consumption is much sharper. And this is the reason that Nordhaus concludes that this is not an optimal solution, because the constraint is overly penal. Now, the model also produces other outputs that are interesting. For example, CO2 emissions, CO2 concentration, and global temperature. Notice in the base case, the emissions and the temperature and the concentration in the atmosphere all rise quite sharply. In the Nordhaus case, emissions peak about 2050 and then fall. CO2 in the atmosphere, however, continues to rise all the way through 2100. And temperatures rise by 2100 to 3.5 degrees above current levels. In the constraint where the average must stay below 2 degrees centigrade, CO2 emissions fall more sharply because of the greater tax. Concentration in the atmosphere actually starts to decline about 2080. And global temperatures don't rise to about 3.2 degrees plus, but that keeps the average over the whole time to 2 degrees. So that's how these models work. Now you might think, well, isn't this Nordhaus model where we're supposedly optimizing social welfare a failure? Because look, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere continues to rise until 2100, and the global temperature continues to rise, being up by 3.5 degrees. Yes, those are problems. Those are downside. But the model involves a trade-off. And that trade-off is what the schematic shows. Let me go back to that. Remember, the goal is optimizing consumption. Some increase in temperature, some increase in CO2 is worth it because it has added consumption. And to get that added consumption, we have to put up with higher temperatures and higher CO2 concentrations and perhaps adapt to those. That's adaptation at the top. So there's always a trade-off between the damages caused by the emissions and the temperature increase and the consumption that arises from the added production. And what the Nordhaus model is doing is trading off those variables. And that's what determines the optimal tax, the optimal consumption, and the optimal rise in CO2 in the atmosphere and temperatures. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. What's going on here? What in the model is saying that this is an optimum? Maybe we'd like to have something more like the CO2 average, even though there's less consumption. Well, let's turn now to the key elements of the model that actually determine what the optimal output is. So here I've listed what are probably the key elements of an integrated assessment model. And the first two are particularly important. The first is the loss function, including the role of adaptation. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. You can see here from the original IAM chart that production leads to adaptation, which in turn leads to the damages. In other words, the damages caused by production depend on the way that society adapts to it. And people tend to downplay the role of adaptation because they have short-term horizons. We live a short period of time. And adaptation may take many generations. To give you just one example, let's go back to the first video where I introduced America in 1870. And at that point, the population of America was 40 million people, and 75% of those people were rural. Today, the population is more than 8 times greater, and 83% of it is urban. That's a massive change, and it's a form of adaptation to changing technology and wealth and so forth. But it's a bigger adaptation than we're likely to require to respond to climate change. So the amount of damage borne depends critically on how we adapt. And that's a very difficult thing to assess. What Professor Welsh and I do, we don't cover adaptation a lot in our book. And in our course, we refer our students to a recent book by Robert Pindick of MIT on climate future, which focuses on the role of adaptation. The media also do not give adaptation sufficient attention because, again, it's a long-run issue. They're concerned with what will get eyeballs today, not what is likely to happen over the next 50 to 100 years. But it depends critically on how the model operates. So that's the role of adaptation. Now, what do I mean by the discount rate? Remember that this integrated assessment model operates over a horizon of 50 to 100 years. And most of the damage occurs, most of the temperature increase in the more distant future. So we're concerned with the damage that's going to occur in 2100 because that's when most of the warming occurs. Remember this chart. Under RCP 6.0, what we emit now has most of its impact in the years approaching 2100, certainly not in the next 5 or 10 years. So the question is, how do we assess the importance of future generations? How do we discount the damages we impose on them? And some argue that that discount rate, like the Stern report, should be very low. People are people. We got to treat them equally. We shouldn't discount future damages at more than 1% or so. Nordhaus, on the other hand, uses a market interest rate, which is about a 5% discount rate. And incidentally, these discount rates are all net of inflation. They're what we economists call real discount rates. Well, that makes a huge difference in how much tax you want to pay now to reduce emissions and thereby protect future generations. You can see this if we go back to the Nordhaus model's output, in particular the CO2 tax. In the Nordhaus case, recall that the tax rises from about $50 to $300. But when you put greater stress on future generations, and one way to do that is to say you're going to hold the average temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. In order to effect that goal, the carbon tax has to be higher in order to discourage emissions. And therefore, it rises from about $60 to $500. In the context of the Nordhaus model, it's important to understand what this carbon tax is. The model estimates the damage associated with an added gigaton of emissions that is not paid for by anybody. For example, when a coal-fired power plant puts CO2 in the atmosphere, it doesn't pay anybody, and therefore it tends to overpollute. The idea of the tax is you charge them the amount that it's costing society when they put that CO2 in the atmosphere. And the model allows calculation of that cost. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that Nordhaus has assumed for 30 years that the optimal approach to coping with climate change is to institute a carbon tax, or really a CO2 tax. And virtually all economists agree with him. In 2019, I believe it was, there was an economist statement signed by over 3,000 economists, including every living Nobel Prize winner and every living head of the Federal Reserve System, for example, all advocating a CO2 tax, not unlike the output of the Nordhaus model. And this has been dead on arrival in the United States and much of the rest of the world. There is no carbon tax approaching $50 per gigaton now, and certainly no hope that in the years ahead it's going to rise to $300, yet alone $500. Why? That's a hard question. Professor Welsh and I have an idea, which I'll tell you, but you can take it with a grain of salt. It's our belief that people discount future generations far more than they're willing to admit. They think, geez, they're going to be 5 times richer than us. They're going to be far smarter. They can deal with the climate problem, and we don't have to. But they don't want to say that. So a simple way to not say it is to simply oppose a carbon tax that reflects the damage that we're likely to put on those future generations. Be that as it may, the integrated assessment models put the carbon tax front and center as the proper policy tool. Now let's just go back and finish the other elements that are not as important but are worth at least noting. The rate of economic growth. The faster a country grows, like China, the more it produces, the more consumption it has. That's all it's good for its citizens. But it also produces more emissions and thereby more damages. And those flow through the model. One thing that is particularly important in the model is how efficient production is with respect to emissions. For example, if technology can improve enough that much of the economy can be electrified, then production could become much more emission efficient, and that would lead to less damage and a smaller required carbon tax in the context of the Nordhaus model. And finally, there's the climate science that's integrated into the model. How much does climate respond to rising emissions? For example, the water vapor feedback effect that I talked about earlier. So all these fit into the model. And Nordhaus himself says he doesn't know how the model is going to come out until he runs it. There are too many complications, too many periods of time, too many feedbacks. And many people criticize these models as simply being, artificial, that they are economist black boxes that aren't worth using. But there's a problem with reaching that conclusion. And that is, what's the alternative? And here I think the Winston Churchill's observation that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. The same holds true for integrated assessment models. What are the alternatives? Intuitive back-of-the-envelope modeling is less likely to offer sensible quantitative CO2 tax prescriptions. Assuming there's no problem is also an integrated assessment model, though a very bad one, contradicted by the evidence. So is assuming that the world will come to an end unless humanity fundamentally restructures and makes changes to its top climate priorities. But that's another bad integrated assessment model. The world will not come to an end. Thus, although IAMS have many deficiencies, they are scientists' best tools for analyzing the collective trade-offs between economic growth, environmental damage, climate change, and CO2 taxation. Thanks for joining us. I know this has been a long one, but hopefully you've learned something about integrated assessment models.